Welcome back to another episode of Bossy, Brilliant, and Badass. I'm Lisa Lindsay here with my bespectacled co-host, Liz Green. Liz, I just noticed your glasses, and that's why I use bespectacled instead of anything else.
I figured.
I was like, oh, I just noticed the blue.
Marshalls, $9.99.
It's very cool. Yes, Liz has on some very cool blue glasses. I don't think you had them on before, but okay.
No.
She just put those on.
It's nice to be able to see for a couple of minutes. But yeah. How are you doing?
I am, you know what? I'm okay. It's busy. You know how it goes when we get into these busy phases. But everything is just chugging along. It's like my busyness is in my personal life. So you know how very where did I get about that stuff?
Right. Yep. Very, very secretive.
I don't like that word. I don't like that word. I just, it's private. It's private. That's all. Yes. That's all. It's private. But so I've got just a lot of stuff going on for the next couple of months. But it is.
But it's good though. It's all good from what I hear.
Liz is telling y'all that she knows something y'all don't know. Yeah.
So branding, we're talking about branding, which is so great. Caley Adams is, I learned so much. I know I always say this, I feel like a kind of a broken record, but I feel like the guests that we have on, particularly in the last few months, just really bring something so unique and different. And I just learned so much about personal branding from this episode.
Right. Yeah. Because it's very specific, right? So, branding is such a very broad topic and people talk about, well, make sure you have your personal brand and you know what it is and how you put it together and da, 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 da. But this is very specific because this is all about what your visual brand, what your brand actually looks like when people look at it, what they see. And that's quite specific. You know what to do with that. You know where to go with that. You know how to think about that versus sort of the big, broad abstract of having a personal brand, right? Which obviously is very important and is where you need to start. But then when you start to kind of pull it together and slice it down, go deeper. And that's part of why we wanted to have her on, is that this is one of those places where we're talking about something very, very specific.
Yes, very specific and very important, right? I mean, it's all visual these days. And it's and half the time, I mean, I know with myself, when I was first starting my coaching brand, I thought, oh my gosh, where do I start? It's about me, and it's also about a service. And so, what do I want this to look like? So that was something that was a bit of a struggle for me at the beginning. And what about you?
Well, yeah, I mean, I've talked about the fact that I got somebody, I put something together in the first instance, and I still have all of it so that people could see so I could see what it looked like, because that came out of my head and it came from a color that I liked. And honestly, it was quite drab and not very interesting or exciting in any way putting it together. So I did end up getting somebody to help me put together my brand now. And I am quite happy with it. And it's coming up on 5 years that I've had it. And I started to think, oh, is it time for me to do something about it? Particularly knowing that we were going to have Caley on. And I was like, nope, still liked it. Still good.
Yeah. I mean, and that's one of the main things, right? Do I still like it? And is this really kind of
still conveys
right, the message that I want to convey about my service? We mostly do talk about branding for services. It's another conversation about products. My first business was product based, and that's a whole nother ball game. But yeah, this is probably, I would say, more specific towards services.
Yeah, I mean, I think because we are both service providers as opposed to product business owners specifically,
and I know there's a lot of listeners that we have that do have product-based businesses as well. So you can just kind of apply both too, right?
Right. Of course. All right. Let's bring her on so that people hear what she has to say.
Yeah, definitely. So Caley Adams is an artist, a designer, and an illustrator, and she has a flair for understanding not only what's aesthetically pleasing, but also what translates into profitable branding. So she's the founder and creative director of Wildest District, and she helps women-led brands find the right balance between form and function. So let's bring her on.
Caley, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
So exciting. Thank you so much for being here. So, all right, usually we don't start like this, but why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and the work that you do?
Yeah, so I run a small design studio in New York. It's called Wildest District, and we work with primarily women run brands, and we build brands for women businesses as well. So anything that targets women as consumers. We do a lot of branding work. We do a lot of web work, app work, packaging, pretty much everything in terms of design. And we work in a lot of different sectors, a lot of ones that we work in a lot, just being kind of in the space that we're in. We work in fashion and beauty, lifestyle, luxury, and health and wellness has been another one in the past like 2 years or so that's really taken off.
Right. Excellent. So when we talk about branding and design, right, it's huge. But I think today what we're going to talk about, what we're going to talk about today is a little bit more about the visual design, what we see, right, when we're thinking about, when we're looking at a brand, and really why it's important to have a little bit of personality when you are putting together your brand, whether you're doing it for the first time or you're doing a brand refresh, and also specifically why it's important for us as women to really inject our personality into that. So I know I gave you a lot there, but where do you want to start with that?
Yeah, so I think it's a huge topic, especially being in the realm that we're in, working for companies that target women as consumers. Women are the most discerning consumers of all. Right. I think that not only do products have to be great, but they have to feel good to use them in our everyday lives. They have to kind of fit into our ethos. And I think that a lot of the times, women are also very choosy about the types of brands that they try just based on how they look. And so it's really huge to carve out a very important niche to create a branding that stands out. And that's easier said than done. I think a lot of the times, with this day and age with Pinterest and Instagram, a lot of this stuff that we see is kind of like programmatically shown to us through an algorithm. So a lot of us are seeing the same types of things. And it kind of puts us into this little vacuum a little bit. And part of the problem too is that when you're a brand that's going into a marketplace, that's especially a very crowded marketplace, it's very important to stand out. And the reason is that, like, if you are the one brand that doesn't look like all the other brands, that's going to be a little bit more eye-catching. You're thinking about discovering brands in your Instagram feed, for instance. That's the way a lot of consumers find brands these days. And if you're a beauty brand, for instance, which we see a lot of this used to happen, where the beauty brands, a lot of them just kind of were all white. Everything was all white packaging, white minimalist backdrops, and you really couldn't tell one from the other. And so when you start seeing these brands that feel very unique and interesting, they're eye-catching in a way that the other ones are not. And so it's important to carve out a niche for your brand in that way visually. And it helps you really stand out above the rest. But like I said, it's harder to do than you would expect, just because we are kind of living in this vacuum world of a lot of these brands looking and feeling the same way, mostly just because we're all seeing a lot of the same influences and inspirations. And so, there are a lot of different ways that you as a brand founder can shape your business to try to make your look and feel a little bit more unique. And I think, so when it comes down to crafting visuals for us, we always try to bake into our process mood boarding, which is a really important step of the process where we go through multiple rounds of iteration, where we look for inspiration, we look for color palettes for type that we like, but we go very deep on things. So a lot of the times you kind of need to, for better or worse, escape the algorithms. If you're looking on Pinterest, like, don't just look at the things that are coming up in your feed, click deeper on things that you like. And, we're finding a lot of really interesting references, just across different sectors and as well. So we try to make sure that we're not only, if we're working for a beauty product, for instance, we're not only looking at beauty products as our source of inspiration and references, and it gets us out of that box, which is good. So the mood boarding process really helps for that.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, so I like go ahead, Liz.
Yeah, I like that too. I like those steps. So mood boarding and really kind of knowing what your inspiration is. And, a lot of our viewers or listeners, they are coaches, therapists, people kind of in that space. So what would you recommend, maybe say one of the first steps in terms of just kind of finding out how to inject your personality into your brand in that way?
Yeah, when you're not a product business per se, because we're referencing products. So
yeah. Well, that's what's even crazier. It does get a lot harder if you're not selling a product, because then you have limited things to work with. You're not working with product shots, so it's even more important to carve out a niche in that type of realm, especially if you're a coach. And this is something I kind of came across organically on my own journey as well, is like, as a studio owner, really, we create work and that's our service, but we're not creating a product. And so it's challenging to kind of figure out differentiators and visual differentiators too, but it's very important to do so. And so I think one of the things that I have become very interested in is injecting in your background, the reason why you got started, the thing that makes you kind of tick, trying to inject that in the visual. So for instance, with us, we work with women-owned businesses. And so because of that became a really good focus. And we really narrowed down on that as a differentiator rather than kind of being a generalist. And that helps you stand out from people. And then when you think about it that way, you really start to carve your visuals around that.
Right. So I have a quick question. I probably should have asked this up front, but when we're talking about visual, right? Color, of course, comes to mind, logo, things like that. But can you tell us, when we're thinking about our brand visually, what all should we be thinking about, right? Because I also think about using photography versus illustrations or things like that. So can we talk through what we're thinking about when we're putting together a brand visually?
Yeah, it's a combination of a ton of different things.
Right.
Color, like you said, brand, like the logo itself, typography, like the fonts that you're using, different color palettes, illustration, even tone of voice and the way that you speak about yourself can be kind of rolled into that brand. And a lot of it may not be on the visual spectrum of things, but the tone of voice can kind of create a balance where you need it in places. So let's say you're a very serious, visually looking brand. You can kind of soften some of that with the language. So there's this push and pull between those two elements, which are really good. And it creates a nice thing that you can play off of. So if you're worried about pushing it too far in one direction, you can always kind of come back around on content.
Right. So what you're saying is, if your type, maybe your font or your colors might be kind of, let's say, not playful, right?
Yeah.
That you could then use language to make the brand playful, if that's what you're trying to kind of meet it in the middle. Exactly. And because you do read, right? So that is still visual in a way, even though there's some mental processing happening there. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Excellent. Right. So all right. So we come to somebody like you, right? And you said mood boarding. So I want to get into that a little bit about what that looks like and feels like and how we want to do something like that.
Mm-hmm. It's really it's a fun process, and really anyone can do this on their own brands as they're kind of trying to workshop how to carve out a niche. Mm-hmm. What we start with always is we come up with a list of competitors that you're either inspired by or you're directly competing against in the field. So maybe that's other life coaches or career coaches, if that's the field that you're in, and you start going to their sites, you go to their Instagram pages, and just take screenshots of anything visual you see. And what's interesting about it is once you kind of take those screenshots, we throw them all into a board for, each brand has its own page. And then when you kind of look at things in totality, kind of squinting and looking at the visuals, trying to disregard what you know about how they're positioning themselves, and just looking at the visuals, my rule of thumb, like I say, is to always squint. So you get kind of like the loose idea. You'll see trends starting to emerge. So you see like, oh, that girl, she uses a lot of blue in her palette, and it feels a lot more serious than this girl over here who's using a lot of beige, and it's lighter and airier. And so we do that with all the main competitors. We do throw together these boards that essentially show the visual nuances and themes of competitor brands. And then that serves as a really good tool. If let's say you print all of those out and then you squint at all of them, it really starts to paint a big picture of what's missing. So let's say you print them all out and they're all these, beige brands with pink highlights. That might be like a screaming opportunity for you to be like, you know what? A yellow might be.
Yeah, I was just going to say
really
yellow.
Stand out. Yeah, I love yellow.
Yeah.
As you can see from my backdrop. But I think that like it's a good opportunity to look at what people are not doing, and then start to think like, okay, that's an interesting play. If I were to come out with a little bit more boldness rather than this more soft palette, it will allow you to look at all of them kind of from that 30,000 foot view and see the competition that way, which is so helpful. And then you can start to think about kind of the ante that there might be pieces that you pick up from each one that you're interested in. But I would recommend trying to think about what's missing and go for that.
Right. Yeah. So what about if somebody, okay, so since we're talking about coaches and therapists, so somebody maybe has a book, and then obviously they have a website, and maybe, I don't know, a podcast or an app. Walk us through what that should look like. Should this all kind of flow together, or what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's really important, I think, to tie your brand together with some persistent themes. And so that might be color, that might be the typography, but making sure that it kind of feels within the same vein is important. But you do have to take into account that different channels are going to have different needs. So, Instagram, it's more of a visual grid. So you're not going to have as much typography on there. So let's think about ways to incorporate a common color palette, which I think is kind of 101 at this point. A lot of people know that like you can kind of form your Instagram grid to make it look all like the same. But it's important to carry that over to the website too, so that people really get a sense for the cohesive brand. And while they're going through it, I think not very many people actually say like, wow, like look at it all up together and say, this feels cohesive. But I think it's important to inject personality into all those different elements. And so you're constantly reminding people about what makes you different from a visual standpoint. So if you are a coach and you're more of an energetic type of person, and that's your goal, and you're more of like a high energy, high impact type of coach, maybe those more vibrant images and vibrant colors and textures will give people that feeling that you're trying to convey of what you want the end result for them to feel from working with you.
Yeah, one of the interesting I've seen, and I don't know if you've seen this, Liz, but I've seen a lot of coaches using that, I'm going to call it gold kind of font. Yeah. And sometimes I like it. Sometimes I'm like, we should do that. But sometimes I'm just like, everybody has that. And I think it's supposed to evoke some sort of richness or like this wealth of that's what I think it's supposed to evoke in whoever's looking at it. Oh, like this person has it together. This is what they're doing. But then it starts to feel very samey overall. Exactly. But I think it's a good look, right? So
I have my logo is all in gold.
Say what?
My logo is in all gold.
Oh, I'm sorry, Liz. I did not know.
Well, hey, you're one of the many then. That's well, it just proves the point. That's great.
I didn't know everybody was doing that. I just know that I love gold and white. So that's how we designed it.
Yeah. that's a really fascinating point, just as a side note there. So that's one thing we always try to talk about with founders is like separating the idea of what you like from what you're trying to communicate. And so that's a really hard thing to understand of like, do I just really like the color pink? Or, I mean, this is the easiest example of this is like, if you're a men's care brand and you just love the color pink, that's great, but it may not work for your target audience who maybe isn't into pink. And so that's one thing that like the mood boarding phase really helps, is trying to like separate, you know, what is rooted in logic and strategy versus what's rooted in what you like. And that's what we try to think about, not necessarily what we like, but what your customers are going to resonate with.
Right.
But yeah, sorry, keep going. I cut you off and went to that side tangent.
No. That's perfect. I think that that's perfect because my logo, which you can see, maybe you can kind of see it behind me, is based on what I liked. And the people that we were working together, you know, she was trying to get the color for me, like a color for me. And she brought me a lot of pastels and I was like, girl, I am going to murder you. Because because I don't think you look at me and see pastel. Like I don't do that. And I mean, I'm an HR consultant, so like primarily so that my brand is just not going to be this girly thing. And I definitely don't want to associate this kind of ultra feminine thing with HR simply because most of your buyers are going to be men.
Yep.
And literally I said to her, you know what I really like? I like this nail polish color. And that is a nail polish color called, I'm not really a waitress, which I think everybody knows that color. If you go into that is a nail polish color that she chose. And then that I shared with her. And she decided to just use it and then add colors around it because she did give me a pastel, like a dusty rose to balance it out, which you'll see on my website sometimes if you look at it, or you'll see it in my documents or whatever, which still brought in the pastel, which I think for whatever reason, she felt like pastel is for you, girl. I don't know. But it's very interesting because I think you're right in sort of the idea of what do you like versus what are you trying to convey. I mean, I feel like it conveys my message perfectly fine. I mean, it's a logo, whatever. It's not a big deal because it is a service thing. And I would never turn around and use this, I don't think, if I was selling a product of some kind, right? I don't know, but I think it works for a service thing. So I like that, making the distinction between the strategy of what you like versus the strategy of what you're trying to communicate, because that's ultimately what your brand is doing, right?
It's really hard. Yeah, it's really hard because a lot of the times too with these, especially your client, the people who are your podcast audience, a lot of them being therapists or coaches, their brand really kind of is them. So it's a challenge to untangle those things. And I think sometimes when you step back, you're like, you have to say, why do people hire me? And so I think for you, Lisa, like you're very outgoing. You're very like personable. You have a high energy kind of vibe, you know? And so like, if I'm coming to you for coaching, what's resonating with me are those things. Like, I like your energy. I like that high energy that you bring to the table. I leave, the sessions, I'm like, yeah, I feel great. So if you're going for that kind of high octane, really an energetic kind of feeling that people can walk away with, then maybe pastels are probably not your thing because, you want people to feel those oranges and those yellows and that vibrance and that fire after they leave meeting with you. So I think that it's challenging to untangle the two sometimes, like when you are kind of selling yourself as a service, but there are ways that you can think about it in terms of what do my customers like about me and how can I visually show that?
Yeah, I like that. Exactly. I like that you talked about like, what do you represent or what do you want to represent? Right. Because I think that that's another strategy. It's sort of like, what are the words that you want to be associated? I think that was actually an exercise that I went through through this whole process of pulling together my brand. It was like, well, what words would you use to describe yourself? And it was less words and like people, because I ended up kind of describing people versus
That's great though.
words,
yeah. That can help too. Yeah.
right? To be able to kind of say, these are the kind of people that I like resonate with. So when people are coming to me, this is what I want to evoke. I mean, I honestly still don't know if that comes across in the brand. I think you still have to kind of meet me to learn that, but it's very interesting to have to, I still like, that's kind of why I'm arguing with you a little bit. Cause I'm like, it's still a little bit of what you like, ain't it though?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, for sure. I think especially, it's a totally different story if it's a, like we had talked about earlier, if it's a product, if you're like a beauty brand, because then it is not about what you like at all, but what's going to resonate with your consumers. But yeah, there's definitely a middle ground there of like, okay, well, if you're the one at the helm of the business and your business really is you, then a lot of it is going to come down to your personal taste. But you have to kind of gut check that on like, okay, if I want people to walk away feeling super positive after meeting with me on a call, then I don't want to kind of like provide a disjointed experience when I'm having people go through my website first and they're seeing this soft kind of like mellow feeling, and then they get on the call and it's totally different. You want to set people up for what they're going to get.
You want it to translate.
And I like
all
what
the
you said there, what do you want them to walk away with feeling?
Right.
For me, I want people to feel safe. I want people to be able to really confide. So so that would be important for me to have my website portray that, right? Absolutely. I know that there's some websites I've gone to with people and I'm just so turned off just by the colors and chaos or what have you. And it's like, okay, well, that person's going to be too chaotic. I don't know if I'll be able to work with them. And you really can tell a lot, right?
You can,
Particularly if somebody does it all themselves,
Yeah, exactly. And it can also kind of signal to the people that you want to work with too, about like what they can expect and what kind of clients you want to take on too. Like you want people who are going to trust you and feel like this is a good space and really open up. And so, like, imagine if your site was all black. That would be so weird. Like all like black with neons. Like that would not feel the same.
No. Right. With skull and bones or something like that.
Right.
Like everywhere.
Yeah, exactly.
Because you just like skull and bones and black.
Yeah, because you just like it. Yeah. Yeah. And like for us, like we struggle with the same thing. A lot of the business that I'm in now that I've created comes from this desire to create projects and work with women, because in the last decade before starting my own business, I really didn't work with a lot of women, and it was hard, like alongside with other women. And it was always wild because I was in these rooms with a lot of men at agencies, advertising agencies, and our clients would be all women, but we would be all male team aside from myself. And so, me going into this, I looked at it and be like, I really felt like I wasn't super heard during that experience and wasn't bringing as much to the table as I could have because I wasn't really given the space to. And so from this, I really want to convey that, like, we're targeting luxury and female audiences. So for instance, I'm not choosing like a really heavy, chunky typeface for all of our branded stuff. It's a very delicate kind of like funky, eclectic one. And that's crucial because it's like, I'm also not doing like the scripty font that feels like too feminine, so that people come to our site and are like, oh, I'm just looking for something that's kind of like quirky and fun and rainbows and pink. Like, you kind of put a net out there, like kind of cast a net in terms of what type of work you want to do too, and then it'll come back to you if you have the right kind of visuals in place to get that. So for us and our site and our brand, it's luxury, but it's also, we go for the kind of luxury look, whereas a lot of studios, they try to do everything very black and white and minimal because they want them to be kind of like a vendor more or less and not really have a stance on aesthetic. And so that way their point that they try to say is that it's making room for your clients' work to stand out. But like, what about you? Who are you? And I think it's important, especially as a service provider too, to like be like, we're an entity as well, and we actually have a perspective that we bring to the table, instead of just kind of like a blank slate that people can project on whatever.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Absolutely.
No, it totally makes a lot of sense. So All right, Caley. So we started talking about how we could kind of focus on doing it ourselves a little bit, or at least I think what helps is at least going through what it is that you might be wanting in your head, at least a little bit. I know we could do the mood board, but I guess my question is kind of twofold. What do we do how do we prepare ourselves if we're going to come to somebody like you, or if we're going to try to do it ourselves?
Yeah, I think really what it is, the most important thing I can say is that it really matters to get it down on paper or to actually start putting these together. Like, it's one thing to kind of like have a Pinterest board of all your ideas in one place, but the second you start dragging them around onto a new page and kind of like arranging them and editing and such, I think that that's important to kind of refine. And I think that there's one stage of kind of ideation, but the next stage is really about execution and trying to go beyond just kind of the high level ideas. So make sure you get a notebook and write it down. Don't just kind of have it in your head, like, I want to be approachable or whatever, because the second you actually sit down with a notebook and you start writing these things out, it's really going to make a bigger difference than you just kind of like thinking through it in your head and doing it on the fly. So like, always set aside the time to do it before you actually start applying it to your website or to your social, whatever. Just create like a high level document that pulls colors, it pulls images, it pulls inspiration and references, and make sure that it's kind of organized and all there together, so that when you go to actually execute on this, you have it there to reference back. Because I found it's also easy to stray from branding as well. So you're like kind of starting in on one thing, and then you go down, and oh, this color looks really interesting. And then before you know it, your brand is kind of shifted and you have a lot more of that one color that you never intended to. And so with like a few pages intact of what you're looking to do, you can always reference it back and check in on it and say, like, does this still align with my belief? And that's the challenge for me as a designer a lot of the times too. I personally, when I'm designing brands, make sure I have the mood boards right next to me, so that I'm constantly reminding myself, like, is this just something I like, or does it still match up to what we had discussed? And it makes it so that like you stay really focused and on that line.
Right. And then what about rebranding? Say if what you've done is kind of, it's like passe and we kind of want to be on trend a little bit more. How would one attack that?
Rebranding is even more challenging sometimes, because when you have a brand established, you kind of have done a lot of the hard lifting up front, just launching it and getting it going. But then to rebrand is really challenging because you're questioning what you are and where you've been. And it's hard to understand how to move forward, because when you think about it that way, it can become really paralyzing. You can see a million different directions you could hypothetically go in. So I think that the important thing to think about is
Caley?
Sketching. Yep.
Oh, I'm sorry. I think we lost you. Did we lose our
Yeah.
list? Okay.
Yeah, we lost for a second.
Yeah. Sorry, we didn't hear you.
Oh, weird. No worries.
Shoot, what was the last thing she said that you heard?
That's okay. I'll go back and I'll
that was perfect.
It's important to make sure that you're doing a brand audit before you actually move in and start doing new things, because without that audit, you're not really going to have a deep understanding of what has worked and what you want to evolve beforehand. So make sure you do the same exercise. You put your brand on a paper with all these visuals next to each other. You can get a glimpse at how things have looked in the past, and then do that again where you hold it up against competitors. You see, like, okay, where am I different and where am I similar, and what can I dial up or down based on what other people are doing and what the market and the industry looks like.
Yeah. So can I ask about images, right? Because everything is so image focused and video focused and all that stuff, and how we can then pull that same branding into our images. And obviously each medium is going to be different. So I'll tell you what I'm thinking about. And I don't know if you know anything about this. But, so I watch a lot of Bravo. Don't tell anybody. But Bravo, a few years back, they actually changed their logo. And I noticed it wasn't that big of a change. I was like, okay, what did they actually really do? But what I did notice is that they changed, particularly on the Housewife shows, the way the editing was done for like their commercials for those shows was very different. Like the visuals of the women and what they were doing, everything looked different, right? So that, I'm obviously not, but I noticed that piece, right? I noticed that piece. So I'm thinking when we're thinking about adding visuals, or like Liz was just asking, doing a brand refresh of some kind, how do we use imagery? How can we use imagery to help?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting you mentioned that specific use case, because people do that quite a bit, where they may not change their colors or their logo, but they'll change kind of everything else around it. Or maybe they'll tweak their colors just a little bit. They'll make it darker or lighter. There are ways you can shift brands in small ways, and then bigger ways, obviously, which are more the brand refresh. But I think that images can really help with a lot of brands, particularly, going back to thinking through if a lot of your listeners are kind of in that therapy, coaching angle of business. I think that putting your face out there obviously is a no-brainer. Making sure people can see you and see what type of person you are, but also your surroundings and any photos with you will also set the tone. So, you were talking about like wanting people to feel comfortable and encouraged to speak up. Well, if you're in a very industrial style kitchen in your photographs, that may not really convey that message.
Mm-hmm.
You want to be on a couch with a cup of coffee, like a friend. You don't want to be sitting up super rigid, or maybe you don't want super high heels on, just because you kind of want to have a visual representation of what that looks like to people. So if you're thinking about it more like a friend catch up, where you're really supportive and you're talking with people one-on-one, then those types of images can really help, especially like posing. You can lean in a little bit to the camera, look directly in the camera so they feel that eye contact. There's a lot of things you can do with images of yourself, but then there are, ancillary images that you can use as well. So you can also think about images to convey the feeling that you want people to get, which is a very abstract thing, but it can really help. So for instance, we just worked on a beverage brand, and a lot of our images, we pulled supplementary images. Obviously the beverage is the main product image, but there's a lot of supplementary images that we were injecting in, of bubbles, of carbonation, of fruit, of ice, because we want people to get this idea of refreshing, flavorful. Mm-hmm. And so when you think about it that way, like, what do I want people to feel? And maybe, like I said, if it's energy and high, like output, maybe you want to showcase images that reflect that as a theme or a concept, things that feel energizing to look at.
Yeah. So that's so interesting that you just said that, right? Because I was just like, well, the bubbles and the carbonation in the fruit, is that too on the nose? But it's not, right? Mm-hmm. I think because one of the things I sort of think about, particularly with us in the podcast, is I always say I never want to see a mic.
Exactly.
in any of our images. And I've got to be honest, very first, when we first started putting it out, it was a picture of a mic, and then that quickly disappeared from Instagram, and it became more about the actual guest that was on the show and showcasing the guest on our Instagram page versus the mic. To me, the mic is like on the nose. So
exactly.
Can we talk a little bit more about that? Because that is probably the thing I see the most of.
100%.
That makes me want to hurl myself out a window. It's like, like, oh my God. Yes, I know you were selling X, like, especially when it's not like a product, like you're saying,
exactly.
Right?
Exactly. Well, there's obviously different kind of like ways to step it out. Like you were saying, there's some that are very on the nose. Like for instance, so we'll take your example and we can kind of like flush it out in this way. So microphone, obviously that's so straightforward, that like you see this too with a lot of people, like if they're coaches, they'll have like their business journal or whatever, like they're taking notes.
Right.
I see a lot of the times too, podcasts kind of shifting away from microphones, but going only one step further, which is like another metaphor for a conversation, which is like a cup of coffee. So a lot of times you see podcasts with like coffee.
Right.
And so that is interesting because it doesn't show the actual, like this is a podcast, but it gets at the idea of conversation. But then you can pull that apart even further. You can think about what people want to walk away from it. So maybe it's inspiration, right? And the most obvious one there is like a light bulb, and you see that too a lot. But when you dig deeper into this, like you think about like more nuanced types of topics like community. You can think about arms interlacing. You can think about people, one person leaning their head on the other person's shoulder. You can think about things like that, which are kind of get at different emotional connections. A good one too. How do you convey connection without showing two people physically talking? You know, there are different ways to do that. And so you can kind of step it out. And obviously, I think from a personal standpoint, just like the further away you can get from showcasing just like the most obvious, the more compelling and interesting it's going to be.
Yeah, yes. I like that. Just the idea of like somebody with their head on your shoulder. I'm like, okay, that's actually pretty interesting.
Exactly.
Yeah, because it's not, again, on the nose. Just another quick question, really quick about images. Obviously, we want to, if we're in service businesses, we want to be showcasing ourselves because we're the business. The ancillary images, though, what do you think? Stock photos okay? Because, you know, there's so many free ones out there. Mm-hmm. Do you have any thoughts around how we kind of pull those in and use stock photos to kind of bump up our brands? Yeah.
Definitely. There's, in this day and age, so there's a lot of design studios out there that I think would think this is blasphemy, but my personal opinion is there are so many good stock photos these days. You do have to hunt really hard for the really good ones, but when you find them, and a lot of them are free these days too, like it used to be 5 to 10 years ago, you could not find good stock and everyone was like, don't ever use stock. It's the worst thing you can do. I think the most successful stock executions tend to be images that are close-up shots because they feel a little bit less generic. So like you think about an office, you can find generic office images everywhere on a lot of stock photography sites, but they don't really feel personable. But the second you get a close-up of like a chair at a desk, you know, that starts to feel a little bit more intimate and more interesting. And there are so many good stock photo sites. My rule of thumb is definitely to avoid, if you can, photos of other people, because that is so challenging to find really good photos of people in stock. And also just like they can be so inconsistent in terms of lighting and styling and whatever. So you might find images of like a very hipster dude and it's kind of a moody lighting. And then you'll find an image of a girl who's like got balloons and, you know, it's just all over the place. And unless you do a photo shoot, it's really hard to get consistent shots of people right from stock. But I think that any kind of secondary shots that you can think of, I think stock is great for that, especially like I said, those like zoomed in. So for the beverage brand I was mentioning, like we didn't just find images of like strawberries. We found images that looked really lush of like zoomed in where you can see the seeds and it's just like a full flood of red. And it's a beautiful image to kind of convey that idea. So where possible, like personally, that's how I try to look at things, is kind of the more zoomed in, starts to feel a little bit more tactile and unique. And so there are really good stock photo sites. Unsplash is a good free one. Stocksy is my favorite paid one because it's very cheap. I'm talking like, you know, you can go to really expensive ones like Getty and, you know, the main ones, iStock Photo, and those tend to be not as good because they're older and more heritage. So like the smaller, more innovative ones are tend to be better results. And so Stocksy is a great one. And it's significantly more less expensive than the big ones out there. But yeah, Pexels, it's like Pixels with an E. They have decent ones as well. Not as, and those are all free, but not as good as Unsplash, but there's just tons of resources out there. And so you can definitely find it. But like I said, I try to avoid really far out, you know, panorama zoomed out shots, and I try to avoid people where possible.
Right. That's great. That's a great tip. Yeah. I think that's a fantastic tip because, you know, I think that that's kind of my struggle. And I know, I think I must have been using like Unsplash or one of them, and I found an image that I particularly love, and I think I still actually have it on my website. But
That's great.
First moment I saw it on somebody else's website, I wanted to cry.
Yeah.
Right, because it's sort of like, well, you're no longer special, right? And that thing probably existed somewhere else on something. I just hadn't seen it yet. But yeah. No, but I like that, because I think stock photos, we're not always going to be able to go out and do a photo shoot with like a branding consultant and say, okay, this is how we want it to look in the mood board. But if we can, pull in stock photos, then that would be really helpful to kind of flesh out whatever it is that we're doing.
Yeah, and it's a good way to add color to a brand too. So like, let's say we had talked about like a kind of a brand that's more white and clean and sterile. A pop of color through photography can make things feel more punchy without feeling chaotic. So a lot of the times imagery can be used to pump up color and pump up emotion in that way, without having to really apply it to your whole site, like full floods of green everywhere.
Right. And then just another question, just that they just keep coming to me.
That's great.
So I'm just curious, like if we're using photo as our main like image, I don't know, medium, I guess. What do you think about adding something different, like maybe a cartoon or illustration or something in certain places? Because those are two completely different mediums. And then, so I don't know, does that work? I mean, I suppose it can in certain cases, but I'm just curious what your thoughts are about that.
Yeah, illustration can definitely be a way to kind of amplify a brand and make it feel more personable, especially like kind of secondary illustration. I'm thinking like line art, for instance. That's really interesting. But what you have to always be considerate of is the balance. So you never want to do 50-50. You never want to be that person who's doing 50% images and 50% illustration. It's, in my opinion, like typically it's about 75% and 25%, one or the other. So that will make it feel cohesive, because the more elements you start throwing in, the more diluted the main brand is going to become, because there's another asset that people have to look at, recognize, and say, oh yeah, that's so-and-so. So, when you're thinking about bringing in illustration, just think about how often it's used and where, and that will help maintain consistency and not dilute anything too much. But I do love adding illustration. I think it's challenging to find illustration that works a lot of the times without commissioning it. But having that said, there's great markets for illustration as well. So like creativemarket.com, they have like really beautiful illustration assets that you can purchase, and it's great. But that's the other challenge too, is in the same way you want photography to feel consistent, you also want to make sure that your illustration assets are consistent too. So you don't want to buy things that kind of deviate from a central theme. So maybe you're using flowers, then don't add trees in, or don't add, other things.
Right.
Just stick with the flowers, and that will help build that consistency.
Right.
Excellent.
So is there anything else you'd like to add into this conversation that we haven't actually spoken about?
Yeah, I think one main thing that I'd love people to think about as they're building brands is don't be afraid to be out there. Don't be afraid to take risks. And I think sometimes that's where you start to look similar to other brands and other people out there, is when you're trying too hard to assimilate. We all go through this. I go through this all the time, where I fight the urge to try to look like everybody else and dress the same way as everybody else, because I feel self-conscious. But the second you're like, you know what, it's okay. Like, I'm going to wear my purple eyeliner today, and it's going to be weird, but it's going to be great. You stand out, and it makes an impression. And so the same thing goes for your brand, where I think some of the most successful brands out there to date have taken really interesting design risks. You think about Snapchat and SoulCycle being that vibrant yellow. That's like a very ownable color. Robinhood being kind of the first app that made a trading platform look cool. And there was a lot of worries in the beginning of that delegitimizing their offering, but in fact, it had the totally opposite effect. And so there is a lot of really interesting things that happen when you kind of, turn away from the crowd and you kind of embrace something different. And it's a challenge because it's always scary and you're going to constantly doubt it all the time. I mean, I look at all our site and all the stuff we put out and I'm constantly like, oh my gosh, I'm not sure. Like that feels like very bold, you know, I'm like very out there. But you know, it's what I think is appropriate for us. And I think it allows you to stand out in a way that's meaningful. So where possible, try to combat the kind of the fear of what if I do this and I'm so different that people don't like me or don't like it. And just remember that like doubling down on it is actually a much more powerful thing you can do.
Yeah. Excellent.
Cool.
Liz, you want to
Yeah. So Caley, so thank you so much. This has been just so informative. So where can people find you?
Yeah, you can find us on wildesdistrict.com, WILDES district.com. And then, Wildest District on Instagram. You can email me directly to Caley at wildesdistrict.com. And would love to hear from everybody and, be a part of the community for sure. I love what you guys are doing and I love the podcast. It's so great to be a part of it.
Great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you for being our badass of the week.
Oh, thanks. That's a great honor. I love it.
Thanks, Caley.